All right, thanks guys for coming out. Thank you, Nerd Night. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to the organizers for having me. This has been a lot of fun. So my name is John Rynearson. I perform stand-up comedy around town as John the Robert, but I'm really happy and keen to use my real name on my real passport, on my real birth certificate with you tonight, because unlike with stand-up comedy, what I'm about to talk to you about is something I actually believe. What a time to be alive. Seriously. My goal tonight is not to necessarily convince you of anything, but simply to explain why I think it is very likely that we are currently living in the most peaceful, most healthy, perhaps even most equitable, if you can believe that, and overall most awesome time to ever have been a human on this planet. Plenty of time for questions, feedback, and objections later. All right, so why should you listen to me? The truth is, you probably shouldn't. I'm not very smart, and evidence of that is I may very well have fallen into the trap of accidentally engaging in some common logical fallacies. So I want you to be on the lookout, okay? I've tried hard, but I'm not very good at this. First of all, of course, everybody's favorite, the straw man. Perhaps I have misrepresented an opposing argument and presented simply a caricature, so be on the lookout for a straw man. Next to the right, I grew up in Texas, so of course my favorite logical fallacy is the Texas sharpshooter fallacy, where we shoot the bullet holes in the barn and then we go and paint the bullseye over it later. Otherwise known as cherry picking your data. A little bit of cherry picking may have happened. I've only got 20 minutes, but be on the lookout for that. Third, some of my generalizations may indeed be sweeping, hasty, or otherwise faulty. And last, I've spent way too much time and effort thinking about this to give up on it now. That is the classic sunk cost fallacy. If you hear any of these, I want you to boo. All right? Little practice, repeat after me. Boo! All right, well done. We're gonna have fun. Okay, a common objection when I start talking about how great life is in the world 2024, the first objection I usually get is, yeah, John, of course it is. Of course it's great for you. You've got all the privileges. 100%. 100% agreed. I am very much inner circle on the wheel of privilege. I've got all the privileges. I'm a white, heterosexual, native English-speaking, university-educated, cis male. Boo. I'm even right-handed. I got a good job, I can get a mortgage, I can use a pair of scissors. It was all set up for me. At one point, I started losing my hair many years ago, and I solved that problem with a hat. The point that I would make in response is that privileged people like myself are much better off now than they were 50 or 100 years ago. And the most destitute amongst us, the most underprivileged people in the world are almost certainly better off today than they were 50 or 100 years ago. And we've got some charts and graphs coming up to talk about that. Okay, this is in 4 chapters. Chapter 1 is war. Chapter 2 is crime. Chapter 3 is health. And chapter 4 is my favorite. That is language. All right, chapter 1, war. Ideas around just war theory go back to the ancient Chinese. There was some degree of philosophizing around whether or not war is justified. However, in ancient China, if the emperor was successful and decreed it to be successful, war was justified. That was about it. Plato in ancient Greece, in the Republic, and later on in a later treatise called Laws, Plato talks a bit about the justification of war, but talks about the ultimate republic as being one of luxury for its citizens. And one way to provide that luxury was to conquer neighboring territories, and thus the provision of luxury for the citizens of that particular polis or city-state was justification enough for the war and the aggression and the violence that had to happen. In general, most of the justification in the ancient world for war can be summarized when Julius Caesar famously said, Veni, Vidi, Vici, I came, I saw, I conquered. That was that, and that was enough. No further justification necessary. Now, the historian and anti-war writer John Mueller notes a shift starts to happen around the year 1700. The justification gets just a little bit better. In some version, Mueller says it's something like, I came, I saw, I was just hanging out, looking around, minding my own business, but then they attacked me, and so I sacked their village and stole their castle, and I won. I guess a little bit of human progress. Also, in the early 18th century, for the first time, we start to see some of the European powers actually pull back instead of double down on colonialism. That is absolutely, certainly not the case with the English and the French. But it is the case, it is almost certainly the case when we think about Denmark, the Netherlands, Portugal, and to a degree, even Spain, for all kinds of reasons. The mid-18th centuries we're well and truly into the European Enlightenment, and the mid-18th century French satirists start making fun of warmongers, most famously Voltaire. All right, fast forward. Does anybody know where this picture was taken? If you can see that. This picture was taken in September of 1914, and that is Littleton Harbor, on the dawn of the Great War, World War I. I think it was in 2018, I went through a fascinating World War I exhibition at the Canterbury Museum. Shout out to Canterbury Museum, with my kids. And I was really, really struck by how fortunate I am to have my children in a time and place where that a conflagration on that epic scale is very, very unlikely. 100,471 Kiwis served overseas as troops or nurses in World War I out of a population of just over 1 million. 10%. Can you imagine 500,000 people out of our team of 5 million being sent overseas due to a broken system of secret alliances amongst traditional European powers that all blew up after a steady growing curve of nationalism and militarism, a dash of muckraking yellow journalism thrown in for good fun, all set off by the assassination of a religious leader. It was an absolutely ridiculous war, and in no way is that meant to denigrate the sacrifice of the brave Kiwi men and women who served in that war and who have provided us with a great deal of our national New Zealand identity. But the fact remains, it is very, very unlikely that such a conflagration could happen again. Look, past performance is not indicative of future results, but I reckon it's very, very unlikely. Steven Pinker talks about the Great Peace post-World War II. Since World War II, there's been a dramatic decline in battle deaths year on year. You see that blip, and maybe we should say the most dramatic decline is since the wars of Southeast Asia in the late 60s and early 70s. America and its allies simply became less inclined to send the sons and daughters of their countries to fight in foreign wars. And one, I guess, kind of unintended positive consequence of a very real problem that a lot of countries have these days is around fertility rates. Most famously in Korea and Japan, very, very low fertility rates. But some commentators have noted that low fertility rates do lessen the likelihood of foreign wars even more, as the populace is even less willing to send the few children they have off to fight in a foreign battle. All right, chapter 2, crime. This is my least favorite part of this presentation, so you can choose to listen to the next 3 minutes or not. Homicide rates over the very, very long term. This is for European countries. The moral of the story is that homicide is much less prevalent today than it used to be. That peak at the top, that is the year 1375 in Italy. I don't know anything about the context of that, so let's engage in some cultural stereotyping and assume that the mafia was kicking ass and taking names. Late 14th century Italy, you also had the Black Death absolutely raging. Moral of the story is that it would have absolutely sucked to be living in Italy in 1375. So be glad that you're not there. Since then, this is England, Sweden, Belgium, Netherlands, France, Spain, a consortium of European countries. Again, moral of the story is that homicide has fallen dramatically over the very long term. Annual murder rate in the United States in a shorter term, lots has been written about the crime wave of the mid-'60s through to the early '90s and the subsequent drop in crime. Nobody's really been able to definitively figure out why either of those things happened. The theory that I think makes the most sense is to do with removing lead from gasoline in the '70s, but I don't know enough about it to really back that up. But the fact is there was a steep decline in violent crime in the States from about mid-'90s until the start of the pandemic. There absolutely was a spike during COVID, and again, lots of criminologists are trying to figure that out, but it is equally true that that spike has come down since the, I won't say the end of COVID, but you know what I mean, since the end of pandemic era restrictions. Now, this graph does not tell the story that I'm trying to tell. This is from New Zealand Police. I tried really hard to give you guys some New Zealand data, and the New Zealand Police, for if there's any Tableau nerds out there, crack into the New Zealand Police database because they've got all kinds of data for all kinds of things, and if you knew how to use Tableau, which I don't, you could have a field day. It's very, very difficult to kind of get consistent data across time on a broad swath of crime because in New Zealand, I guess the incidence of reporting crime and what kind of counts as crime and what's been defined as crime has changed significantly over the years. However, I use this recorded murder graph because murder has pretty much been defined as murder, and we haven't really tried to come up with alternative definitions of murder since 1926. Interesting. There's a couple of things that I find interesting on this graph. You can see there that spike is in 1983. So between 1980 and 1983, the number of murders went up quite a bit, and then a similar decline to what we saw in the States. But since then, you know, the trends have been pretty iffy. Obviously, the tragedy at the mosque is responsible for that most recent spike, which, as tragic as it was, I think is fair to say was an outlier event. All right, chapter 3, health. Now, let me check my time. I was born in 1975, and I often wonder how I ever survived. My dad smoked. All my uncles smoked. My grandmother smoked. They all smoked inside, and this is actually true. They smoked inside on flammable couches. In 1975, 39.3% of Americans smoked. In 1976, the closest year that I could get data from smoke-free Aotearoa, in 1976, 40% of Kiwis smoked. Can you even imagine? If we were doing this in 1976, this room would be full of cigarette smoke. Yeah? And Trash Queen would be picking up cigarette butts all day tomorrow. So last year, 6.8% of New Zealand adults defined as people ages 15 or over defined as smoked at least one cigarette a day. 6.8%. Life expectancy at birth seems like a pretty good harbinger of overall health trends. In 1960, the average Kiwi could expect to live to be 71. In 2020, the average Kiwi was making it to 82. That's a pretty good effort. 11 extra years just for being born later. Another common objection I get is, yeah, John, okay, maybe it depends on where you're born. You know, New Zealand's a wealthy country. Despite all of our moaning about all of our very real problems, New Zealand is very much a wealthy first world country. So I had a look at the 5 poorest countries in the world: Burundi, Mozambique, Congo, South Sudan, and Central African Republic. Now, the increases in life expectancy are surely certainly not as stark as the previous graph, but the fact remains significant increases in life expectancy have occurred even in the most destitute amongst our world. And finally, child mortality rate has declined substantially. The lines on this graph are for the USA, New Zealand, the UK, and Australia. If I take you back to the beginning of the Great War in 1914, 6% of newborns born in New Zealand would perish before the age of 5. 6%. So put yourself back to 1914, hanging out in Littleton, watching everybody get on that boat. 10% of your neighbors went off to war. 6% of your neighbors suffered that horrible tragedy of losing a child before the age of 5. It is almost certain that every Kiwi would have known people in both of those categories. All right. Chapter 4 is language. In 1972, the late, great George Carlin performed for the first time one of the most famous stand-up comedy routines of all time. The 7 words you can't say on television. We're all adults here, but hold your ears if you're sensitive. Shit, piss, fuck, cunt, cocksucker, motherfucker, and tits. Tits, really? Now, Carlin was arrested 6 times for obscenity for performing that routine in the 70s. And, maybe that's just because America was even weirder and more backward then than it is now. I don't know. I don't know that Carlin ever performed that routine in New Zealand in the 70s. I do know, and this was before my time in New Zealand, I do know that the Toyota Bugger ad in the early 90s caused quite a kerfuffle. Not that anybody necessarily was arrested for it, but that's the kind of stuff that people actually used to care about. I think it's interesting, and the American linguist John McWhorter notes, it's not for nothing that the only remaining taboo words in the English language are slurs. And I truly believe that that is a sign of progress. You're not feeling me. We can talk about it later. I do think that is a sign of progress. I heard, you know what I'm talking about, the N word, the F slur, the R word, that kind of stuff. I think this is just completely anecdotal, personal experience. I think it was within the last 5 years that I heard the word neurodivergent for the first time. And again, maybe I was slow to pick up on that. But I did an Ngram search. You guys know what Ngram is in Google, so you can do a search for the instances of a word published in an English language book or magazine article. And so I compared, the R word to neurodivergent. It's pretty incredible juxtaposing graphs. But when I first heard that word, I thought, wow, I know exactly what that means, and that is a much, much, much better replacement. So McWhorter would say, the American linguist, that the fact that our unutterable words in public nowadays is a sign of progress in the sense that the truly taboo has to do with slander against groups of people. And I think that is something to be celebrated. All right, quick bibliography, and then you guys can argue with me if you want. Steven Pinker, I don't have any original ideas. Most of this stuff came from Pinker. Steven Pinker's 2011 book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, Why Violence Has Declined, is very much an overview of kind of the central thesis I've got here. As Pinker said, as one becomes aware of the decline of violence, the world begins to look different. The past seems less innocent, and the present less sinister. I mentioned John McWhorter, the American linguist. 9 Nasty Words is an incredibly entertaining and interesting kind of etymology of the worst words. Human Progress is a website, newsletter that kind of can put a positive spin on the state of the world. And then finally, shout out to Daniel Kahneman. Kahneman passed away earlier this year. I haven't really had time to kind of talk about why is it that we're so convinced that the world is so bad. And there's some, I think, very good and reasonable reasons for why we think that. But Kahneman was a psychologist, cognitive scientist slash economist, won his Nobel Prize in economics, and Kahneman and his research partner Amos Tversky famously came up with the idea around heuristics and cognitive biases. So Kahneman, I think, would say that availability bias and confirmation bias is what kind of keeps us in such a kind of negative mood about the state of things. But that is I think cognitive biases are certainly more dangerous and more difficult, much more difficult to handle than the straw man and the Texas sharpshooter fallacy I talked about at the beginning. All right, guys, thanks for coming out. My name's John. Have a good night. Happy to take any questions.
First off, thank you so much for this one. It was interesting. I want to highlight one thing about the language thing that you were saying, that we're less censored. So I'm a psychologist and I specialize in sex and relationships. And if you've ever been on TikTok and on sex and relationships, kind of like threads or anything, a lot of professionals cannot even say the words sex, porn, rape. They say grape, they say corn and stuff like this. So there's a lot of censorship. It's just very invisible because it doesn't reach people. And I wondered, because you said, boo, if you're finding yourself, in a confirmation bias, and I wonder whether you have seen any censorship or areas of censorship that are not what you spoke about, such as like race and stuff like that.
So I don't know anything about TikTok, and I have no expertise to respond to your question at all. So I know that's super not helpful. In terms of censorship, I don't think this counts as censorship. But just give you an example. So in the late 70s, so I'm like a real big music guy. I did a lot of research about the New York and London punk rock scenes of the late 70s. So the N-word was all over the place from progressives, right? Because they thought that was cool. So Patti Smith, a legend of that scene, her most famous song is Rock and Roll N-word, and she sang it at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame induction ceremony in 2017. I don't know if she still plays that song now. She's mostly retired. But that song, the title of that song is unprintable. And I'm cool with that. I'm fine with that. That's okay. I don't need to see that word printed, And I don't need to sing along with that word. I don't know if that's what you're getting at, but my point is the slurs have become virtually unutterable and completely taboo. Yes.
What about those people who live in the war right now and they're fighting and dying? Are there like a little bit of exception from all this hippie rest?
No, so I'm glad you brought that up. So absolutely tragedy exists and war exists. The point I am trying to making is it absolutely exists on a much, much smaller global scale than it ever has before. And I know that is incredibly callous of me to say that. Yeah. It would be a horrible thing to say that to someone suffering in Gaza or Ukraine. So I absolutely accept that as an objection. But from an overall high level, if you're one of the 8 billion people living here, your chances of being involved in one of those wars is less now than it ever has been.
I agree with a lot of what you've said, but it's what you haven't mentioned, what I found quite interesting. What's your opinion on the mental health of the world? Because I feel like that's an area which is getting a lot worse. More people die from suicide than from murder, war, conflict combined. And I was wondering what you had.
Yeah, and you're right. I wouldn't argue that fact at all. And I don't know that this is a very satisfactory answer, but my sort of go-to answer is, yes, absolutely, mental health is a massive problem. I have a 13-year-old daughter. Instagram and social media, TikTok absolutely freaks me out. However, at the same time, my 10-year-old son is much less likely to go to war. And I feel like I have a better chance of handling, I'm just going to stop talking now because I'll get myself in trouble, and I'm not an expert to talk about mental health. But I think the two things go hand in hand, and I think we can celebrate the decline in war and the increase in peace while also acknowledging that mental health is a massive problem.
Last question. I know you said you shouldn't make statements, but I
asked for it. That's all right.
The murder rate incidence in the US, the graph, I noticed that it had a decline down to the 1980s, and then from the 1980s it suddenly took off again. I didn't need it.
Yeah, so
I don't think that was the one, was it?
Yep. So from 1960 up to
oh yeah,
early
that is
80s.
the one. Yeah,
Yep.
It's got quite a peak, but it goes up again in the 1980s. I think coincides with the modern recent war on drugs, the Reagan thing.
100%.
That's a statement I just wanted to make.
That is.
Thank you.
Yep. 100%. That is absolutely true. All right. Thanks, guys.